Hi there. I return to the question of the words that Gnostics sometimes use or use quite frequently. For example, here's a statement or a phrase from my own corpus, which is the soul is trapped in the worlds of the demiurge. And this follows classical Gnosticism and a little bit uh, my own modification of that, talking about the worlds of the demiurge, the etheric psychic worlds of the demiurge, which are just as entrapping, if that's the right word, to the soul as this material world. So I've extended the idea of matter spirit dualism to include a lot of spirit dualism, as it were, and the spiritual worlds are not transcendental enough, which is a mantra that I often employ nowadays. It's like one of the rather controversial one, I have to say as well. But if you look at this statement, I mean, in the face of the English School of Philosophy, A.J. Ayres and Professor Grayling, and with his little book Against All Religions, of course, this statement actually means nothing. It's nonsense. It's a nonsense statement, and because we exist really as a result of chance. If the numbers had been differently crunched, differently chosen, we wouldn't be the species that is dominant on this planet. There'd be another species. And of course, we may not be the species, in fact, that is dominant for very much longer. And all other things being equal. So it's chance alone. There's mechanical causality. Even if you take causality to its quantum level, there's still nothing left of the human personality after death, and of course there is no God. So all statements pertaining to spirituality are meaningless because there is no spirituality on which these statements are based. The assumption of spirituality and the assumption of the existence of God really falls, and therefore all the statements about God and about spirituality and about psychism and about ghosts and about life after death, they're all actually talking about different things, in fact, if you think about it logically. But they all fall, basically, and they're all meaningless. And sometimes there is an interesting sort of psychological aspect to this materialism, because it really does sort of, it lets you out off the hook, as it were. You don't have to worry about whether things exist or do not exist. I mean, in the human world, of course, there are ethics and morality, which are arrived at rationally through philosophical inquiry, and so you don't need God to be good. In other words, you don't need to believe in a life after death in order for certain other things to follow from that assumption. I mean, you are sort of rested, as it were, from the chore, really, and responsibility almost in believing in things which you can't see or can't detect or are metaphysical in that sense. So it's rather nice, actually. It's rather comforting. It's even rather comforting, I suppose, to believe that there is nothing after death to survive, and it doesn't survive, because the story's over, really. Individually the story's over, and there's no need. You can rest in peace, and you're not disturbed by thoughts and the reactions and emotions and situations and circumstances and developments and all the rest of the stuff which we detect with our senses on this earth and in this material existence. That's all gone. So in many ways, it's rather nice, really. It's rather comforting, actually. They talk about the comfort of religion, but I think also the comfort of rationalism is there as well, really. And it's not exactly nihilism, but it's just the realization that we only have the here and now, and we only have the material to work with. And when our brains cease to function, we don't have to worry about anything. We don't have to worry about physics anymore. We don't have to worry about metaphysics for sure. So all the statements that people produce about spirituality, they're nothing more than sort of, I don't know, poetic references or references to, I don't know, some kind of imaginary situation or imaginary being or set of beings that is all right for Harry Potter, but really is of no concern to the person who is a rationalist and materialist. And so there's a kind of liberation there, as it were. And it's no good worrying about the fact that you're not going to exist anymore because you didn't exist before. And you could say you don't exist now, really, apart from a sort of set of photons buzzing about the place, or a set of quantum algorithms which are only temporarily existent, and you will fall back into non-existence thereafter. And what's wrong with that sort of thing? I I sometimes think, oh, what the hell, sort of thing. And then, of course, there is the fact that there's good, the statement refers to something which is literally true, and that's kind of interesting, actually. This is confirmed, of course, by messages, by intuition. There's a list there of all the things that are confirmed as a result. You go into another state of consciousness, and which makes you able to see things which other people can't see or can't detect, and then you come back with evidence or proof that the statement, well, there is a soul and it is trapped in the worlds of the demiurge. The demiurge does exist. The worlds of the demiurge do exist, and it's all literally true. Now, it could be true on a different dimension, and that's okay. I've talked about the what I call the quasi-literalism of the born-again Christians and fundamentalists, which I had the unfortunate pleasure of being associated with when I was young. And the thing about that, you see, is that it's a bit sort of like 1984, because they might say Jesus lives, and you might say where. I can't see him, and then you get a smack. That is sort of, you weren't allowed to say actually that Jesus exists in another dimension, which is accessed by your heart, by your emotion, by a certain emotion, for example. You weren't allowed to say that on another dimension, the world perhaps is only 4,000 years old, and God did make the world in 7 days, and creationism is true on another dimension. But it's also true that the planet is 4,000 million years old, and we are here by a process called evolution. And that's also true, but you weren't allowed to say that. You basically had to believe in an invisible God, an invisible Jesus, um, because you were told to believe that. You couldn't say, all right, I believe in creation on another dimension, but evolution on this dimension. You weren't allowed to say that either, especially that, really. So everything was about faith and obedience, basically, to tradition and to the words of the pastor, and to the church authorities and to the charisma of the Christian church, which was true even if you couldn't see it or feel it, or you couldn't understand it. If you chose to understand the miracle of the resurrection in any other way than literal, you weren't allowed to do that. Even though if you believed in the miracle of the resurrection on a different dimension, surely that's literalism, But that wasn't enough. You had to believe it in the here and now. You had to believe it on this dimension, And if you questioned it, you weren't a good person. You were an evil person. You see. So that's what I call sort of quasi-literalism. That's my definition of it. It's a form of mind control, really. How many fingers am I holding up, as it says in 1984? And not only do you have to say it's three fingers, when in fact it's four, but you also have to really believe that it's three fingers that are being held up, not four, you see. Otherwise, you're not sincere enough, okay? And you can't say, oh, well, on one level you're holding four fingers, on another level you're holding three fingers. You've got a smack for that as well. But I'm quite prepared to believe that on another dimension, or on many different dimensions, many things are true, literally true. So there literally is a soul that's literally trapped in the worlds of the demiurge, even though you can't see it, taste it, detect it. But on the other hand, you do have this thing called transcendental magic, where people can train you can train your mind to see into these dimensions, or experience or detect these dimensions, which statements like the soul is entrapped in the world of the demiurge is actually literally true, you see. Um, so that's sort of one thing, but it brings me on to the other, that basically, the statements of metaphysics sort of open up a narrative, which in fact from this narrative, which isn't supposed to be taken literally true, arises a certain method, a certain way of looking at the world, which then creates in your mind a certain method. And this method is what's important, not really what inspired the method to come into existence. And this comes down to the final thing, where basically I've talked about the statements that are made, metaphysical statements are made, which they coincide with a reality, which in fact of which no statements can be made, because it's beyond definition, beyond expression, beyond even detection, and yet it is possible to experience this other reality, even though it can't be expressed or detected, which in itself is a logical contradiction. And also this word coincides, which I have trouble with, really. How can a statement coincide with a reality? That's an interesting thing. Does language coincide with reality, or does language point to reality, or is language part of the reality? And I just leave that as an open question, really, because I can't figure out the answer to that, if indeed there is a rational answer to that, really. But again, the method is important here, because there emerges a certain method. Somebody thinks of something called meditation, for example, or introspection, as I call it, which is neither meditation nor contemplation. And you sort of introspect, and you have a method of introspection, which makes certain assumptions about the universe, which coincides with another reality. That this method enables you to prepare yourself to detect. And that's kind of a bit of a mouthful, really. But if you think about that for a bit, and so what it is, it's quite practical, really. The narrative of metaphysics is airy-fairy, apparently, but it actually gives rise to a very practical meditation, or method that you can employ every day, to align yourself to a certain spiritual reality, which actually can't be described, and probably can't be detected either, despite the claims of magicians that it can be detected once we have trained our minds to detect it. But I'm sort of saying, in counter to that's not transcendental enough, really. And that only gets you into another world, which is another world in which your soul is trapped, you see. So I think that that's about as far as I can take this question of language. I mean, I don't really know about other dimensions where things are literally true either. I'm talking about another dimension in which basically nothing that we say is true, because it really is utterly utterly other rather, than any words that we could possibly use to describe it. And it's utterly other to any means of detecting it. And yet, statements have arisen over the centuries about this dimension, and these words, although they don't mean anything in themselves, sort of coincide with this reality, or perhaps point to this reality, or perhaps put into crude terms the experience of this reality. And these words, airy fairy and vague as they are, have given rise to a method, or say of meditation or mantra or introspection. And this method is very practical, and at least you could say that this method leads to a calming of the mind. So we go into sort of Buddhist territory here, whereby there is no metaphysics to Theravada Buddhism, for example, and even where there is metaphysics, it doesn't mean anything. It's empty. It's just a form in which the Buddha nature can reside, or take form. And that Buddha nature is basically a method of Buddhist meditation and contemplation, on the releasing from grasping, and a release from the ego. So basically, when you die, you have to learn to release utterly. And the Buddha nature, it basically transcends your own ego. You can't say I am. After you've died, you can't say I am anymore, because you utterly become absorbed. You're absorbed utterly into the Buddha nature. So after death, it's almost really, well, speculation as to survival after death is as meaningless as if you were a materialist. It's just as if you're a Buddhist, you have a way of calming the mind and of letting go of your ego, and not entering into fear of death, because you don't mind becoming extinct, you see. So Buddhism and materialism and atheism, they have a coexistence, so they coincide as well. I'm more of a practical person than I am an intellectual. And I want a method. I want something which I can do every day, that I can train my mind to let go and not go into fear and depression, and not sort of want to speculate about the hereafter or about whether God exists and what sort of God would exist, blah, blah, blah. I always want to let go of all that. I certainly don't want to get into the situation where somebody has to believe something because I say it, and it must be true. I certainly don't want to become like that, a cult leader, for example, who is charismatic and who people believe in what you say because they like you. That's rubbish. I'm not a charismatic figure, thank God. People, I don't think people do like me. I don't want to be liked. I don't want to be said to be telling the truth because people like me, because that's an emotional thing. I want to prove things rationally, with philosophy, if I can. But I also want to suggest to you a method whereby you can transcend rationality and philosophy itself, and come to a different sort of conclusion about the universe, which isn't literal. It doesn't have a literal metaphysics, but there is a spiritual reality out there, which you can experience, even though you can't describe, or you can't detect as the word detect means, sort of thing. So it transcends detection as well, which is something that possibly doesn't mean anything at all. I don't know. But anyway, so a method is there, and if you take a method away from this whole YouTube channel, and someday I'm going to have to consolidate all these methods into one method that you can practice every day, that basically coincides with some kind of spiritual reality, which you don't really need to describe or even detect. necessarily, but which is sort of there as a voice of the silence, a still small voice. But you don't need anything dramatic to happen in order to prove the existence of God or to prove angels exist or there is life after death. You're really not looking for proof. But you're not also saying, well, the material is all that there is. So you're sort of, you're kind of an existentialist, as it were, but you're also not denying that there is a reality which is other than the reality that we can detect or think about now. That's basically all I'm saying, and all I'm saying is that the descriptions of this other reality don't mean anything really until they create a method or suggest a method by which you can go into yourself, go within, and find a sort of still center, as it were, within the storm of present existence. So it's almost really like it's a sort of second death, really. You're almost going in, you're through meditation, introspection, even through prayer, even through Jesus prayer or mantras. You're really going to a place where you are resting in peace, actually. And that's about pretty much all you can say about the possible results of this methodology that might be suggested by the language of metaphysics. Now I've got to find my cursor. I've got to find the still center.